The thing no one tells you about a sniper's laser is how utterly innocent it looks. Just a tiny, dancing speck of cherry red, like a child's toy playing across the lapel of a dark, expensive wool suit. Audrey didn't have time to weigh the odds. She didn't think about the crippling rent she owed, or her brother waiting for her in their freezing apartment. She just saw that lethal red dot settle directly over Dominic Castellano's heart, and her body moved before her brain could stop it. She dropped a heavy silver tray of crystal glasses and tackled the most dangerous man in Chicago to the hardwood floor. A millisecond later, the window exploded. The evening of October 14th started exactly like every other Friday night at Lombardi's Prime, loud, demanding, and drenched in the scent of aged ribeye and expensive bourbon. Lombardi's wasn't just a steakhouse, it was an institution in Chicago's River North district, a place where politicians shook hands with men whose wealth was accumulated in the shadows. Audrey Fowler wasn't supposed to be wearing a stiff, heavily starched white apron, pouring $300 bottles of Cabernet for men who tipped in crisp $100 bills, but never looked her in the eye. At 24, she was supposed to be in her second year of law school. Instead, her younger brother Leo had developed a gambling addiction that morphed into a severe debt to a Southside loan shark named Carmine, the Butcher, DeLuca. Law school money became survival money. Every shift at Lombardi's was a desperate claw toward the $30,000 they needed to keep Carmine's enforcers from breaking Leo's legs, or worse. Her manager, Richard Gable, a nervous man who perpetually sweated through his collars, cornered her near the service station at 8 o'clock. "Audrey, table 7, Richard hissed, his eyes darting toward the secluded corner booth by the floor-to-ceiling reinforced windows. "Castellano just walked in. He requested your section. Don't make eye contact unless addressed. Don't hover. Pour the drinks, serve the food, and become invisible. Understood?" Dominic Castellano. The name alone sent a shiver through the kitchen staff. He was the newly appointed head of the Castellano syndicate, having taken the reins after his father's sudden heart attack 6 months prior. The FBI called him a ruthless racketeer. The local papers called him a dark, enigmatic businessman. As Audrey grabbed her serving tray, her hands shook slightly. She walked out of the swinging kitchen doors and saw him. Dominic wasn't a caricature of a mobster. There were no flashy pinky rings, no loud suits. He wore a charcoal bespoke suit that fit his broad shoulders flawlessly. He was in his early 30s, with sharp, aristocratic features, dark hair swept neatly back, and eyes the color of a winter sky, cold, gray, and piercing. He was flanked by 3 massive men, but Dominic was the undeniable center of gravity in the room. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said, keeping her voice steady, professional. "Can I start you off with something from the bar?" Dominic didn't look at a menu. He looked at her. It was a calculating gaze, one that made her feel stripped down to her barest anxieties. "Macallan 25. Neat. 3 of them," he said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that barely carried over the restaurant's ambient jazz. "And a club soda with lime for Arthur." He gestured to the largest man at the table, Arthur Boyle, a notorious enforcer known for his terrifying efficiency. "Right away, sir," Audrey nodded, retreating to the bar. As the night wore on, the tension at table 7 was palpable. Dominic and his men weren't just eating, they were conducting a tense, hushed meeting. Papers were slid across the table, voices were kept to harsh whispers. She learned the choreography of their dinner quickly, step in only when their glasses were half empty, clear plates from the left, never startle Arthur. Audrey was exhausted. Her feet ached in her cheap black shoes, and her mind kept drifting to Leo. It was 10:15 p.m. Carmine's deadline was midnight on Sunday. She was still short $4,000. The sheer weight of her reality made the glamorous, dangerous men at Table 7 seem like actors in a play she was forced to watch. She resented their wealth. She resented the casual way Dominic left a stack of banded $100 bills on the table as a visual aid for whatever illicit deal he was negotiating. She picked up her tray to clear their appetizer plates. The restaurant had begun to thin out. The lights were dimmed further, casting long, dramatic shadows against the dark mahogany walls. Audrey approached the booth from the window side, her back to the dark, rain-slicked Chicago street outside. That was the exact moment her life and Dominic Castellanos violently collided. Audrey stepped up to the table, balancing the heavy silver tray on her left hand. "May I clear these for you, Mr. Castellano?" she murmured. Dominic leaned back against the plush leather booth, a half-empty glass of Macallan in his hand. He gave a curt nod, his attention focused on Arthur, who was aggressively whispering something about a shipment at the docks. As she reached across the table to grab a porcelain plate, Audrey glanced down. The lighting in Lombardi's was carefully curated, warm, ambient, cast from vintage Edison bulbs. There were no harsh lights, no neon. But there, right on the lapel of Dominic's charcoal suit jacket, was a light. It was a tiny, brilliant, cherry-red speck. It wasn't stationary. It jittered for a fraction of a second, moving from his left shoulder, sliding across the fine wool fabric and settling with terrifying stillness directly over his heart. Her brain processed the impossibility of it in a microsecond. A red light in a dimly lit restaurant, a straight line of sight from the window behind her to his chest, the empty Palmer building under construction directly across the street. Sniper. Fear is a strange mechanism. For some, it paralyzes. For Audrey, forged by years of hypervigilance, protecting a self-destructive brother from violent loan sharks, fear was an electrical charge. It bypassed conscious thought. She didn't scream. A scream would take a second. A second was too long. She dropped the heavy silver tray. It crashed onto the table, shattering crystal glasses and sending amber whiskey flying. In the same motion, Audrey threw her entire body weight forward. She launched herself across the table, grabbing Dominic by the lapels of his jacket, and shoved him violently backward. "Get down!" she shrieked. Dominic's eyes widened in sheer shock for a fraction of a second before gravity and her momentum took over. They tumbled backward out of the booth, her apron tangling with his suit, hitting the hardwood floor with a bone-jarring thud. Audrey landed hard on top of him, her shoulder driving into his chest. Crack hiss. It wasn't a loud boom. It was a sickening, high-velocity snap, followed by the devastating crash of tempered glass. Where Dominic's chest had been a second prior, the leather back of the booth simply exploded. Stuffing and shredded leather rained down on them. The heavy porcelain plate she had been reaching for disintegrated into a cloud of razor-sharp shrapnel. Chaos erupted. Screams tore through the sophisticated hush of the restaurant. Diners dove under tables. "Shoot her! Across the street!" Arthur bellowed, flipping the heavy oak dining table onto its side with an incredible display of brute strength to create a barricade. He drew a massive handgun from inside his jacket in the blink of an eye. Dominic lay beneath her, the breath knocked out of him. Audrey was trembling violently, her face buried in the collar of his shirt. He smelled of expensive cologne, gun smoke, and spilled whiskey. "Are you hit?" Dominic demanded, his voice instantly losing its shock, replaced by a terrifying, icy command. His large hands gripped her waist, assessing her. "No," she gasped, though a stinging pain flared across her cheek where a piece of flying porcelain had sliced her. "No, the light. I saw the light." "Stay down," he ordered, rolling them both smoothly behind the overturned table, pinning her between his body and the solid oak. He drew his own weapon, a sleek, matte black pistol. Another high-velocity round shattered the remaining window panes, burying itself into the mahogany paneling behind the bar. Richard, the manager, was screaming in the corner. "Artie, lay down suppressing fire. Vinny, get the cars to the alley doors." Dominic barked over the noise. Arthur popped up, firing 3 deafening shots through the shattered window toward the dark construction site across the street. The noise in the enclosed space was agonizing. Dominic looked down at her. His icy grey eyes locked onto hers. There was no warmth in them, but there was an intense, piercing calculation. She was a waitress, a nobody, and she had just tackled the boss of the Castellano family out of the path of a customized .338 Lapua Magnum sniper round. "You moved before the shot," he said, his voice barely a whisper, yet she heard it perfectly over the screaming and gunfire. "How?" "Red dot," she choked out, tears of sheer adrenaline blurring her vision. "I saw it on your chest." He stared at her for a long, heavy second. The implications were spinning behind his eyes. Was she a plant? Was she part of the hit? Or had a minimum wage waitress just saved his life? "Vinny, the kitchen is clear. Let's move," one of the guards yelled. Dominic hauled her to her feet by the collar of her uniform. "You're coming with us." "What? No, I need to go home. You just compromised a multi-million-dollar hit, sweetheart." Dominic cut her off, his grip like a steel vice on her arm, as he dragged her toward the swinging kitchen doors. "Whoever pulled that trigger knows your face now. You walk out the front door, you're dead by morning." They dragged her through the industrial kitchen of Lombardi's. Pots and pans clattered to the floor as the cooks scattered in terror. They burst through the heavy steel double doors at the back, spilling into a freezing, rain-swept alley. 3 black SUVs were idling, their tires screeching as they threw themselves into reverse to shield them. Dominic shoved her into the back of the middle SUV. He slid in beside her, Arthur jumping into the front passenger seat. "Drive, the safe house in West Loop," Dominic commanded. The driver slammed on the gas, and they tore out of the alley, leaving the wailing police sirens far behind. The inside of the SUV was silent, except for the heavy breathing of the men and the roar of the engine. Audrey was huddled against the door, shivering uncontrollably. The adrenaline was crashing, leaving her nauseous and painfully aware of the throbbing cut on her cheek. Blood had dripped down her neck, staining the collar of her crisp white shirt. Dominic didn't say a word for the first 10 minutes. He sat in the darkness, staring straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles jumped. Finally, he turned his head to look at her. "Name," he demanded. Audrey," she stuttered, wrapping her arms around herself. "Audrey Fowler." "Turn on the dome light, Artie," Dominic said. The soft yellow light flooded the back seat. Dominic reached into his jacket and pulled out a clean white handkerchief. Before she could flinch away, he leaned in and pressed the cloth firmly against the cut on her cheek. His touch was shockingly gentle, entirely at odds with the violence that surrounded him. "Hold that there," he instructed. She obeyed, pressing the cloth to her face with trembling fingers. "Who do you work for, Audrey Fowler?" Dominic asked. The question was soft, but it carried the weight of a death sentence if she answered wrong. "Lombardi's, Richard Gable. I've been there for 2 years." "That's not what I asked." He leaned closer, invading her space. "Civilians don't react to a laser sight. They freeze. They get confused. They don't launch themselves across a table into the line of fire. Who tipped you off?" "No one," she cried, her voice cracking with panic. "I swear to God, I was just clearing the table. I saw the light. It looked wrong. It just looked wrong. I didn't think. I just reacted." Arthur chuckled from the front seat, a dark, ugly sound. "Boss, she's lying. She's a plant. The Morettis probably paid her to set you up. Maybe she panicked when she realized she'd be in the splash zone. "If I was setting him up, I would have stepped back," she yelled, anger suddenly piercing through her fear. "I wouldn't have tackled him. I saved your damn life, you ungrateful—" She clamped her mouth shut. "You don't yell at a Mafia boss in the back of an armored SUV. Dominic held up a hand, silencing Arthur. He continued to study her face. "You have reflexes honed by trauma, Audrey. Your eyes were darting all night. You were tracking the exits. You were watching the street. You live in a state of hypervigilance. Why?" She swallowed hard. She couldn't tell him. But looking into those cold, calculating eyes, she knew he would find out anyway. "Debt," she whispered. "My brother. He owes money." "To whom?" "Carmine DeLuca." The name hung in the air. The atmosphere in the SUV shifted instantly. Arthur turned around in his seat, staring at her. Dominic's expression darkened. "The butcher?" Dominic said softly. "Your brother is into Carmine the butcher for money?" She nodded miserably. 30,000. It's due Sunday night. If we don't pay, Carmine's guys are going to take it out on Leo. I've been working double shifts. I watch the doors because Carmine's collectors have shown up at my apartment. They've shown up at the restaurant. I'm always looking for threats. When I saw the laser on you, I just reacted to a threat." Dominic leaned back into the shadows of his seat, a dangerous, contemplative silence washing over him. Carmine DeLuca was a mid-level player, a notoriously vicious loan shark who operated under the umbrella of the Moretti Syndicate, Dominic Castellano's primary rivals, the very same rivals who had likely just ordered the sniper hit. "We're here," the driver announced. The SUV pulled into an underground parking garage of a high-rise building. The iron gates slammed shut behind them, sealing them in. "Artie," Dominic said as the car parked. "Make a call. Find out exactly how much this Leo Fowler owes Carmine." "Boss, what are you doing?" Arthur asked, a warning in his tone. "She's a liability." Dominic opened his door and stepped out into the dimly lit garage. He turned back, his tall frame blocking her exit. He looked down at her, bruised, bleeding, and terrified in her ruined waitress uniform. "She's not a liability, Arthur," Dominic said, his voice echoing in the concrete space. "She just bought my life. And in our world, a debt of blood must be repaid." He reached out, his large, calloused hand gripping her elbow, pulling her out of the car. "Carmine DeLuca doesn't own your brother anymore, Audrey," Dominic stated, his eyes locking onto hers with a possessive, terrifying intensity. "Because as of tonight, I own Carmine, and I own you." The elevator doors glided open, revealing a penthouse that spanned the entire top floor of the West Loop high-rise. It was a fortress of floor-to-ceiling bulletproof glass, brushed steel, and cold, polished marble. Through the expansive windows, the glittering skyline of Chicago looked like scattered diamonds against the black velvet of the night, the dark ribbon of the Chicago River winding below. To someone else, it might have looked like paradise. To Audrey, it looked like a very expensive cage. Dominic led her inside, his hand still firmly gripping her elbow. The adrenaline was entirely gone now, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a throbbing pain radiating from the cut on her cheek. "Sit," he commanded, pointing to a sprawling slate-grey leather sectional. She sank into the cushions, her cheap, blood-stained apron a jarring contrast against the pristine Italian leather. Arthur and the other guard, a lean, sharp-eyed man named Matteo, fanned out, checking the perimeter and locking down the biometric security systems. "Matteo, call Dr. Harrison. Tell him to get up here." "Discretion is mandatory," Dominic ordered, shrugging off his ruined charcoal suit jacket and tossing it onto a glass coffee table. His white dress shirt was completely pristine, save for a faint smudge of ash on the collar. "I don't need a doctor," she protested, her voice raspy. "I need my phone. I have to call Leo. If Carmine's men saw the news about the shooting at Lombardi's, they might panic. They might go after him early." Dominic walked over to a wet bar crafted from dark mahogany and poured 2 fingers of amber liquid from a square crystal decanter. He didn't offer her any. He took a slow sip, his grey eyes pinning her to the sofa. "Your brother is currently hiding out in a basement apartment off Lower Wacker Drive, heavily intoxicated and entirely unaware of the bloodbath you just circumvented," Dominic stated calmly. Her heart stopped. "How do you know where he is?" "Because the moment you mentioned Carmine DeLuca in the SUV, my men geolocated your brother's burner phone," Dominic said, setting his glass down. "He's secure. I have 2 men watching the perimeter of his building. Carmine's collectors won't get within a mile of him tonight." She stared at him, unable to process the sheer velocity of his power. 10 minutes ago, she was a waitress drowning in a $30,000 debt. Now, the head of the Castellano family was deploying soldiers to protect her deadbeat brother. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered, wrapping her arms around her knees. "You don't owe me anything. I reacted. It was a reflex." Dominic closed the distance between them, stopping just inches from the edge of the sofa. He loomed over her, a predator observing an entirely new species of prey. "In my world, Audrey, everything is a transaction," he said, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating with an intensity that made her breath catch. Salvatore Moretti ordered that hit. He hired a professional, likely an ex-military contractor, to take my head off in public. You disrupted a multi-million-dollar assassination. You bought me time. And more importantly, you bought me my life." He reached out, his knuckles brushing lightly against her uninjured cheek. The contrast of his rough, calloused skin against her face sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. "A Castellano never leaves a debt unpaid," he murmured. "Carmine DeLuca operates out of a meat-packing plant in Fulton Market. He pays kickbacks to the Moretti family. By sunrise, Carmine will no longer be a problem for you or your brother." "You're going to kill him?" The words tasted like ash in her mouth. She was a law student. She believed in the justice system, no matter how broken it felt when she was staring at eviction notices. Dominic's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm going to restructure his business model. Dr. Harrison is here. Let him look at your face. Matteo will show you to the guest wing. There are clean clothes in the closet. They belonged to my sister. Use them." Before she could argue, a discreet chime echoed through the penthouse, and a distinguished-looking man with a black medical bag was ushered in. Dominic turned his back on her, picking up his phone to make a call that would undoubtedly end in violence. As Dr. Harrison stitched the cut on her cheek with practiced, silent efficiency, Audrey realized the terrifying truth of her situation. She hadn't just saved Dominic Castellano. She had tethered herself to him. She didn't sleep. The guest suite was larger than her entire apartment, boasting a king-sized bed with Egyptian cotton sheets and a bathroom lined with Calacatta marble. She had showered, washing the smell of gun smoke and spilled whiskey from her hair, and changed into a pair of soft cashmere sweatpants and an oversized grey sweater she found in the closet. She paced the floor, watching the digital clock on the bedside table click closer to 4 a.m. The penthouse was eerily silent. Dominic had left 3 hours ago with Arthur and a heavily armed crew. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the cherry-red laser dot dancing across Dominic's chest. She saw the glass exploding. And then she thought of Leo. Her brother was a fool, a gambler who couldn't stop chasing the next big win. but he was the only family she had left after their parents died in a pile-up on the I-95 years ago. At 4:15 a.m., the heavy oak door of her bedroom clicked open. She spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs. Dominic stood in the doorway. He had changed out of his suit into a black tactical turtleneck and dark jeans. He looked exhausted, the sharp angles of his face cast in shadow, but his eyes were blazing with a dark, triumphant energy. In his right hand, he held a thick manila folder. In his left, he held a heavy, gold Patek Philippe watch. She recognized it instantly. It was the watch Carmine, the butcher, De Luca, proudly wore, a flashy symbol of the blood money he extorted from people like her. Dominic walked into the room and tossed the watch onto the pristine white duvet of the bed. It landed with a heavy, sickening thud. "Carmine?" she choked out, taking a step back. "Indisposed," Dominic replied coldly. He opened the manila folder and pulled out a stack of papers. He held them up. She could see Leo's messy, desperate handwriting at the bottom of the top page. It was the promissory note. The markers. Dominic didn't hand them to her. He walked over to the modern gas fireplace, set into the wall, clicked the ignition, and tossed the papers into the blue flames. She watched as the physical manifestation of her living nightmare curled, blackened, and turned to ash. $30,000 of terror, gone in 3 seconds. "He's free?" she asked, her voice cracking, tears pricking her eyes. "Leo is safe? Your brother is currently on a private jet, bound for a rehab facility in Sedona, Arizona," Dominic said, turning away from the fire to look at her. "The facility is highly secure. It's owned by an associate of mine. He will stay there for 6 months. It's fully paid for. He will receive the help he needs, and he will not be allowed to leave until he is clean." A sob tore from her throat. She covered her mouth with both hands, the sheer relief buckling her knees. She sank onto the edge of the mattress, trembling. For 2 years, she had carried the weight of their survival entirely on her shoulders. In one night, Dominic Castellano had obliterated the burden. Dominic approached her slowly, his heavy boots silent on the plush rug. He stood in front of her, and to her shock, he knelt down so they were at eye level. "The debt is settled, Audrey," he said quietly. "Thank you," she wept, unable to maintain her defensive wall. "You didn't have to do the rehab. You didn't have to do any of this. I told you, I pay my debts." He paused, his gaze dropping to her lips before rising back to her eyes. The temperature in the room seemed to spike. But Carmine was very talkative before he retired. She wiped her eyes, catching the sudden dark shift in his tone. "What do you mean?" Carmine confirmed the Morettis were making moves, but he laughed when I asked about the sniper at Lombardi's. Dominic's voice was a low, dangerous purr. He said Salvatore Moretti doesn't use snipers. Salvatore likes car bombs. He likes making a public mess. A suppressed point, 338 Lapua from a dark building? That's surgical. That's an inside job. A chill washed over her, completely erasing the warmth of the fire. "Inside job?" she echoed. "You mean someone in your crew?" "Only 3 people knew I was changing my schedule to eat at Lombardi's tonight," Dominic said, his jaw tightening. "Arthur, Matteo, and my underboss, Silvio. The sniper didn't just know I was going to be there. They knew exactly which booth I preferred, and they knew to set up in the Palmer building across the street." He stood up smoothly, towering over her once again. The air crackled with lethal tension. "The war didn't start tonight, Audrey," Dominic said, his eyes scanning the shadowed corners of the room as if the betrayal was hiding in the walls. "It's been brewing inside my own house, and whoever pulled that trigger knows you ruined their perfect shot." He looked down at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of genuine concern beneath the cold exterior of the Mafia boss. "You can't go back to your apartment," he stated, leaving no room for argument. "You can't go back to law school. You can't go back to Lombardi's. Until I find the rat in my organization, you are the only variable they didn't account for. You belong to me now, Audrey, and I protect what is mine." The next 72 hours blurred into a tense, suffocating purgatory. The West Loop penthouse, with its panoramic views and cold, polished marble, felt less like a sanctuary and more like a high-altitude bunker. Audrey was entirely cut off from the world. There was no phone, no internet, and absolutely no contact with the outside, save for the encrypted, sporadic updates Dominic received from his remaining loyalists. She spent her time pacing the length of the expansive living room, her mind constantly churning, trapped in a relentless loop of anxiety. She missed her heavy, highlighted law textbooks. She even missed the exhausted, aching satisfaction of a double shift at Lombardi's Prime. But mostly, she was terrified of the icy, simmering rage radiating from Dominic. He was a man possessed. He barely slept, consuming nothing but black coffee and the occasional glass of scotch. He spent hours on secure lines, his gravelly voice echoing off the bulletproof glass walls as he ruthlessly interrogated captains, reviewed grainy security footage, and hunted for the ghost inside his own machine. The atmosphere in the penthouse was thick enough to choke on. Arthur and Matteo, Dominic's two most trusted guards, patrolled the perimeter with restless, aggressive energy. They viewed her with a mixture of suspicion and grudging respect, but they were just as on edge as their boss. Everyone knew that an inside job meant the enemy was already breathing the same air. On the fourth night, the silence became too much to bear. The digital clock on the bedside table read 2:14 a.m. Audrey threw off the heavy duvet, wrapped herself in the oversized cashmere sweater she'd commandeered from the guest closet, and ventured out of her suite. She found Dominic in his expansive home office at the far end of the hall. The room was dark, illuminated only by the harsh, blue-white glow of 3 massive computer monitors and the amber embers of a dying gas fire in the hearth. The floor was literally littered with thick, red-banded financial dossiers and printed bank statements. "You're bleeding your own organization dry, looking for a needle in a haystack," she said softly, standing in the doorway. Dominic didn't look up from the heavy leather-bound ledger in his hands. He was wearing a rumpled white dress shirt, the collar undone, and the sleeves rolled up past his elbows to reveal dark, intricate ink snaking up his muscular forearms. He looked devastatingly exhausted, the sharp angles of his face hollowed out by stress and paranoia. "The sniper was paid, Audrey," Dominic rasped, his voice rougher than usual from disuse and cigars. "Professional hits of that caliber don't happen on a handshake. A customized .338 Lapua Magnum rifle, a sanitized firing position in a secured commercial zone, a guaranteed exit route past Chicago PD, they cost high 6 figures, upwards of $1 million. That kind of money always leaves a paper trail, even when it's meticulously washed." She stepped fully into the room, her bare feet silent on the Persian rug. The sheer volume of paperwork was staggering. Her law school training, buried beneath years of waitressing and panicked survival, flared to life with sudden, undeniable intensity. She knew how to read contracts. She knew how to track corporate entities. "You're looking at this like a mob boss," she pointed out, gesturing to the scattered files. "You're looking for enemies, for obvious betrayals, for sudden spikes in cash flow among your captains. But if someone inside your house is doing this, they aren't using street money. They're using corporate money." He finally looked at her, his grey eyes bloodshot and heavy with fatigue, but a spark of sharp intelligence flared within them. A silent conversation passed between them in the dim light. He was a man who trusted absolutely no one. His survival depended on that paranoia. Yet she was the only person in his orbit who had absolutely nothing to gain from his death. Slowly, deliberately, he slid a massive stack of Shell Company filings and legitimate front ledgers across the wide mahogany desk. "Be my guest, counselor," he murmured, leaning back in his heavy leather chair. She pulled up a chair opposite him, dragging the files close. For the next 3 hours, the only sound in the office was the sharp rustle of paper, the soft clicking of a keyboard, and the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Audrey dove into the financial labyrinth of the Castellano Syndicate's legitimate holdings. She cross-referenced the property records of the Palmer building, the unfinished construction site where the sniper had perched, with Castellano off-the-books accounts, shell corporations, and vendor payments. It was a tangled web of dummy corporations, offshore accounts, and blind trusts designed to obscure the true flow of capital. "They layered it deep," she muttered, rubbing her tired eyes as she traced a series of wire transfers. Whoever funded the hit didn't just withdraw cash, they created a phantom vendor. At 5:30 a.m., just as the sky outside the floor-to-ceiling windows began to turn a bruised, pre-dawn purple, her finger stopped on a dry, seemingly innocuous LLC registration filed in Delaware. "Dominic," she said, her pulse suddenly hammering against her ribs. "Look at this." He was beside her in an instant, his large frame leaning over her shoulder, his hands resting on the back of her chair. The proximity sent an involuntary jolt of electricity down her spine. She could smell the faint, masculine scent of his cologne, mixed with the bitter tang of black coffee. "What did you find?" he demanded, his focus absolute. "This company," she tapped the paper, "Aegis Holdings. It was registered exactly 3 months ago. The primary beneficiary is listed under a blind trust in the Caymans, which is standard for your type of business. But look at the legal representative. It's a man named Nathaniel Cross." Dominic frowned, his brow furrowing, as he stared at the name. Cross is a high-level corporate fixer out of Miami. He washes money for the South American cartels. We don't use him. He's too flashy, too expensive, and a known entity to the feds. "You don't use him," she corrected, pulling a corresponding ledger from the Castellano legitimate shipping fronts and laying it beside the Delaware filing. "But someone in your organization authorized a massive wire transfer of $850,000 to Aegis Holdings disguised as a consulting and logistics fee for dock renovations at Pier 44. The money was routed through 3 different banks before landing in the Aegis account." Dominic went completely, terrifyingly still. The ambient temperature in the room seemed to plummet. "Arthur is my muscle," Dominic said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet, lethal whisper. "Matteo handles the street-level operations, and the soldiers. Neither of them knows how to structure a multi-tiered corporate wire transfer. Only one man manages the legitimate shipping fronts and has the ultimate signature authority on those specific commercial accounts." She looked up at him, her heart sinking as she realized the magnitude of what they had just uncovered. Silvio. Silvio was Dominic's underboss. He was the man who had mentored Dominic, guided him after his father's sudden death, and served as the respected elder statesman of the Castellano family for decades. "He bought the Palmer building access through Aegis," Dominic said, piecing the puzzle together aloud, his eyes darkening with a profound, agonizing betrayal. "He hired the shooter. He knew my schedule that night because he was the one who built it. He suggested Lombardi's prime. If I died, Silvio takes the throne automatically, claiming it was the Morettis who ordered the hit. He gets the entire empire without firing a single shot himself, without risking a civil war." The silence that followed was heavier than anything she had ever experienced. Audrey watched the realization tear through Dominic. The cold, calculating Mafia boss fractured for just a second, revealing the deeply wounded man underneath. His mentor, his father's oldest friend. He slowly straightened up, his face hardening back into an impenetrable mask of granite. The sorrow was gone, replaced entirely by a cold, merciless resolve. "He didn't account for you," Dominic said softly, looking down at her. "He built a perfect, mathematically flawless assassination. And a 24-year-old law student waitress broke his math." Before Dominic could reach across the desk for his secure phone to give the order that would end Silvio's life, the penthouse plunged into absolute, pitch-black darkness. The low hum of the HVAC system died instantly. The computer monitors went black. A split second later, the backup emergency lights kicked on, bathing the entire penthouse in a harsh, bloody red glow. Then, the blaring, ear-splitting shriek of the perimeter breach alarm shattered the silence, echoing violently off the marble floors. "They're here!" Dominic snarled. He drew his weapon from his shoulder holster in a fluid, terrifyingly fast motion. He grabbed her arm, his grip unyielding, hauling her out of the leather chair. Silvio knows the paper trail was vulnerable. He's not waiting for a sniper this time. Gunfire erupted from the private elevator lobby, a terrifying, rhythmic thud of heavy-caliber automatic weapons tearing through the reinforced steel doors. The sound was deafening, a physical force that vibrated through the soles of her bare feet and rattled her teeth. Arthur and Matteo were out there, holding the primary choke point, but the sheer volume of incoming fire told her instantly that they were vastly outnumbered. "Move!" Dominic didn't yell. His voice was a sharp, tactical bark that cut straight through the chaos. He shoved her hard toward the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lining the far wall of the office. "I'm not hiding in a closet while you get shot," she screamed over the din, her survival instincts kicking into a chaotic overdrive. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely feel her fingers, but she planted her feet on the Persian rug, refusing to be shoved into a dark box. "Audrey, for once in your life, do exactly what I tell you," he roared. He slammed his palm against a concealed biometric scanner embedded in the mahogany trim. The massive bookshelf clicked heavily and hissed, swinging outward on hidden hydraulic hinges to reveal a steel-lined panic room packed with communication gear and weaponry. Before he could physically throw her inside, the floor-to-ceiling glass walls of the office completely imploded. It wasn't a shatter. It was a detonation. A breaching charge blew the reinforced glass into a million deadly, diamond-like projectiles. Two men in full black tactical gear, their faces obscured by ballistic masks, poured into the room through the jagged opening, assault rifles raised and sweeping for targets. Dominic moved with the ruthless, terrifying efficiency of an apex predator. He didn't flinch at the exploding glass or the sudden influx of heavily armed killers. He stepped perfectly in front of her, shielding her body with his own broad shoulders. He fired his weapon, two deafening, concussive cracks that left her ears ringing with a high-pitched whine. The first tactical operative dropped instantly, his momentum carrying him forward as he crashed through the ruined glass coffee table. The second man managed to squeeze off a wild, panicked spray of bullets. The rounds chewed aggressively through the massive mahogany desk, sending jagged splinters of expensive wood flying into the air, grazing her arm. Dominic didn't even blink. He adjusted his aim by a fraction of an inch and put a single round through the second man's chest. "Boss, we can't hold the lobby," Arthur's voice crackled over the intercom on Dominic's shoulder, tight with pain and exertion. "Matteo took one in the shoulder. There's a dozen of them. They're bringing up thermal breaching charges for the secondary doors." "Fall back to the terrace," Dominic ordered, his eyes sweeping the ruined office for more threats. He grabbed her hand, his grip bruising and absolute. "We can't stay here. The panic room is a coffin if they have thermite." They sprinted out of the office, their feet sliding dangerously across the polished marble hallway floor, which was now slick with blood and covered in shattered glass. The red emergency strobes pulsed, casting nightmarish, disjointed shadows against the walls as they bolted toward the massive, open-concept kitchen at the center of the penthouse. They threw themselves behind the massive, 10-foot granite island, just as the heavy, reinforced oak double doors of the main living room were blown entirely off their hinges. A thick cloud of grey concrete dust and acrid white smoke billowed into the penthouse, choking the air and stinging her eyes. Through the haze, the silhouettes of half a dozen armed men fanned out, their laser sights cutting through the smoke like predatory red eyes. And then, a single figure stepped forward, casually walking through the destruction. It was Silvio. Unlike his mercenaries, he wasn't wearing tactical gear. He wore an immaculate, perfectly tailored tan cashmere suit, a silk pocket square neatly folded at his breast. He looked entirely, obscenely out of place amidst the blood and rubble. He held a silver, long-barreled revolver by his side, his weathered face set into a mask of cold, calculated ambition and profound entitlement. "It's over, Dominic," Silvio's voice echoed through the ruined, cavernous penthouse. It wasn't the voice of a frantic killer. It was the calm, measured tone of a disappointed uncle. "Arthur is pinned down on the terrace. Your communications are jammed. You have nowhere left to run. Step out from behind the counter. I'll make it clean. A single shot to the back of the head. For your father's sake, I won't let you suffer." Behind the granite island, Dominic quickly dropped the magazine from his pistol and checked it. Audrey saw his jaw clench. 3 rounds left. He didn't have a spare magazine on him. He looked at her, crouching in the shadows beside him. Her oversized cashmere sweater was covered in grey dust, her knees were scraped, and she was clutching a heavy, cast-iron skillet she had blindly grabbed from the stovetop during their dive for cover. He looked at the frying pan, then up at her terrified but defiant eyes. Despite the fact that they were seconds away from being executed, a grim, dark chuckle rumbled in his chest. "You're a terrifying woman, Audrey," he murmured, a thin stream of dark blood trickling from a shallow cut on his forehead, stark against his pale skin. "I prefer resourceful," she whispered back, her voice trembling so hard it cracked. Then her nostrils flared. Beneath the overwhelming stench of cordite, burning wood and copper blood, she smelled something else. It was faint at first, but growing rapidly stronger, a distinct, rotten egg odor. Mercaptan. She looked frantically over her shoulder at the commercial-grade, 8-burner Wolf range they were using for cover. During the initial crossfire, a stray, high-velocity bullet had punched straight through the stainless steel casing and completely sheared off the main natural gas valve. She could hear it now, a high-pitched, steady hiss of highly pressurized, flammable gas flooding the enclosed space of the kitchen. Her eyes met Dominic's. She didn't say a word. She just pointed emphatically at the sheared pipe, then up at the massive industrial metal range hood hanging directly above it. Dominic's grey eyes flashed. He understood the physics instantly. He looked at the heavy cast-iron skillet in her hands, then back to the range hood. "When I move," Dominic ordered softly, his mouth inches from her ear, "you throw it as hard as you can, and you flatten yourself against the floor. Do not lift your head." "Dominic, if this doesn't work—" "It will work," he interrupted, his voice laced with absolute certainty. "Because I don't lose." "Silvio!" Dominic suddenly shouted, his voice booming over the hiss of the gas. He stood up from behind the granite island, deliberately exposing himself from the chest up, making himself the sole target in the room. "You want the crown? You want to sit in my father's chair? Come and take it from me." Silvio stopped walking. A cruel, victorious smile spread across his aged face. He raised the silver revolver, pulling back the hammer with a distinct, metallic click. "With absolute pleasure, kid. You never deserved the Empire anyway." As Silvio's finger tightened on the trigger, Audrey didn't freeze. Her body remembered the red dot at Lombardi's. It remembered the necessity of movement. She surged up from her crouch and hurled the 10-pound cast-iron skillet across the kitchen with every ounce of adrenaline-fueled strength she possessed. She didn't aim for Silvio or his men. She aimed straight up. The heavy iron pan smashed violently into the thick, brushed steel rim of the industrial range hood directly above the leaking gas valve. Metal ground savagely against metal. A shower of brilliant, white-hot sparks rained down into the invisible cloud of natural gas. She threw herself flat against the marble floor, covering the back of her neck with her hands, her mouth open to equalize the pressure. The spark caught. The explosion wasn't just a sound, it was a catastrophic, world-ending physical entity. A concussive shockwave of blinding blue and roaring orange fire detonated in the center of the kitchen. It instantly blew the remaining cabinetry off the walls and sent a solid wall of kinetic force tearing outward through the living room. From her position on the floor, Audrey felt the intense, blistering heat wash over her back, instantly singeing the air directly out of her lungs. Over the deafening roar of the blast, she heard the distinct chaotic sounds of Silvio and his heavily armed mercenaries being picked up and thrown backward like broken rag dolls, engulfed in the sudden flashover. Dominic had dropped back down a millisecond before the ignition, throwing his heavy body completely over hers, shielding her from the worst of the thermal wave and flying debris. A second later, the penthouse's commercial fire suppression system triggered. Hundreds of concealed nozzles in the ceiling dropped open, raining a torrential downpour of freezing, pressurized water down on the burning wreckage of the apartment. Coughing violently and gasping for oxygen, Dominic hauled himself up off of her. The water plastered his dark hair to his forehead and washed the soot down his face in dark streaks. Through the thick, swirling smoke and the artificial rain, he walked slowly out from behind the shattered granite island. Silvio lay 20 feet away, groaning in agony amidst the smouldering ruins of the leather sectional. His immaculate tan suit was scorched black and smoking, his silver revolver lost in the rubble. Dominic didn't hesitate. He didn't offer a grand, final monologue or ask for final words. He walked up to the man who had mentored him, pointed his matte-black pistol down at Silvio's chest, and fired his last remaining round. Absolute silence finally descended on the penthouse, broken only by the steady, heavy hiss of the sprinklers and the distant, wailing chorus of police sirens approaching the West Loop high-rise. Dominic stood over the body for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back to her. He was soaked to the bone, bleeding from multiple cuts and covered in ash. But as he looked down at her, the cold, impenetrable mask of the Mafia boss finally slipped. He reached down, offering her his hand. She took it, and he pulled her effortlessly to her feet, not letting go, but pulling her flush against his hard, wet chest. Her hands naturally found their way to his waist, clinging to the wet fabric of his shirt. "The debt," he said, his voice incredibly rough, his thumb reaching up to gently wipe a streak of dark soot and blood from her cheek. "Is officially paid in full. Carmine is gone. Silvio is dead. The board is clear. You're free to go, Audrey. I'll have Arthur arrange a new identity, a new city, whatever you want." She looked up into those icy grey eyes, which were now burning with a raw, possessive intensity that had absolutely nothing to do with debts or survival. She thought of her old, freezing apartment. She thought of the sterile law library, the crushing weight of a normal, terrifyingly mundane life where she was always the prey. Then she looked at the man who had burned down her debts, pulled her from the mundane, and literally shielded her from a fiery blast. She didn't step back. She stepped closer, closing the final inch between them. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice remarkably steady, despite the adrenaline still shaking her core. "Someone has to audit your offshore accounts. You're terrible at paperwork, and Nathaniel Cross is going to need a visit." A slow, devastating, and entirely genuine smile broke across Dominic Castellano's face, transforming him from a cold-blooded killer into something far more dangerous. He leaned down, his lips brushing against hers, a fierce, claiming promise of danger, absolute power, and a completely different kind of life. "As you wish, counselor," he murmured against her mouth, right before he kissed her, sealing the contract in the ashes of his ruined empire. The thing no one tells you about surviving a sniper's bullet is how entirely it rewrites a person's gravity. Audrey was a waitress drowning in debt, terrified of the shadows, measuring her life in unpaid bills and missed sleep. When she tackled Dominic Castellano out of the path of that cherry-red laser, she thought she was simply saving a man's life. She didn't realize she was obliterating her own. The law degree she eventually earned wasn't used in a sterile courtroom, but in the mahogany boardrooms of the Castellano Syndicate, laundering peace and enforcing order alongside the most dangerous man in Chicago. She never went back to Lombardi's Prime. She never poured another $300 bottle of wine. She didn't have to. She had traded a life of fear for an empire of shadows, and as she stood beside Dominic, watching the city lights from their rebuilt penthouse, she knew she would never flinch at the dark again.